happiness. We crave it, we ponder it, we talk about it. We think we know what will bring more of it, but do we really? What if the pursuit of happiness actually makes us less happy? But then if that's the case, what's the alternative outside of giving up? Welcome to the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper, co-founder of the Catalyst Coaching Institute, and today's guest is organizational psychologist and behavioral scientist, Dr. Mike Rucker. He's the author of the best-selling book, The Fun Habit. In the middle of a unique journey, he made an important discovery, and we'll obviously be talking about it, about happiness and how that might be a game changer for the way you look at life. Now, depending on when you're listening to this, you may still be able to join us for the final MBHWSC approved coaching certification this year. It's a big decision, obviously, so please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to discuss details about how it fits into your current or maybe future career plans. Just drop us a note, results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com, and we'll set up a time to discuss it. Or you can check out all the details on the website if you want to do that first at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Now, it's time to get fanatical with Dr. Mike Rucker on the latest episode of the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast. Dr. Rucker, love your story. You don't just talk about fun and the pursuit of happiness. You're doing your best. We talked a little bit offline about this journey you started in 2007 called the Live Life Love Project, and you made it so practical. You wanted to interview 200 thought leaders, engage in 100+ intriguing life experience. We got to talk about some of those, and contribute a year's salary and a year's worth of work hours to charity over the next 25 years. What started all that? What was the genesis of that? And I mean, 25 years, that's not I'm going to do this for the next year, or 6 months or 3 years. I mean, that's a lifetime for a lot of people, unfortunately. Talk us through how that all came to be.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, I've been interested in web for some time, publishing in various capacities. And for me, it doesn't seem that extraordinary. Like, I just wanted to have a blueprint where I was doing the things that I wanted. I had been entrepreneurial up to that point. I had started a web agency and had a successful exit. And then I tried to open a taco stand on the beach of Manhattan Beach. And that
what a change.
Yeah. And, so I was at a point in my life, I had to go back to work, and I wanted to still be connected to entrepreneurship and the ideas around health and wellness. And so it was really just a way to make sure that happened. Right. So, at the time I have no problem disclosing that I was working with, Meredith, which is a company that owns Better Homes and Gardens. They were collaborating with a big real estate conglomerate called Realogy to launch the Better Homes and Gardens real estate brand again. And then it had gone dormant, and they were launching it again. But I was working for a paycheck for the first time in a long time. And I wanted to make sure that I had this framework that was still authentic to my true self, and I was still doing the things that I wanted to do. And so for me, because I love systems, that seemed fairly ordinary. And now, that I've gotten through like half of it, people are like, that's pretty extraordinary that you said this,
seriously.
You put into motion a 25-year commitment and you're still doing it. And I'm like, well, and I think, when you unpack it, anyone could do this, right? I made sure that the bar was low enough so that, because I've certainly fallen victim to overprescription. I actually talk about that in my forthcoming book that I know we're going to get into, where a lot of times, we've been led to believe that BHAGs are important, and I think they are to some degree. Stretch goals have their purpose, but oftentimes, especially for A-type folks, we'll build these things that are just too complex, which doesn't allow us to execute. And if you do that too often, that's when you see folks, just fall short, right? Or over time, unfortunately, feel like they can't do things when, if you start to celebrate the wins. So that's why, part of what we're discussing the goals are only, one thing each quarter. Right. And so, the bar was fairly low, and, but yet now that I've indexed all of these things, quarter after quarter, I do look back and I would agree. Like, I don't want to sell myself short. I mean, it's led to some pretty amazing opportunities, and just those connections that you make. I mean, I know you must feel the same way. You're getting close to 200 interviews, and you might have 200 interviews in the can. I know there's about 200 of your interviews online, and I bet you feel the same way, right? That personal growth from, getting to meet people that's
beautiful.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, is it extraordinary? Now I would give myself some credit, like, especially since I followed through. But I think the takeaway for anyone listening is that set up your own system that's, aligned with your identity and your values, and you can use it as a North Star to kind of move yourself forward. Certainly if you find yourself where I was in 2007, having to go back to work, but still wanting to feel connected to entrepreneurship and living a life well lived. Yeah.
I love that. And folks, those of you who go, the what? The BHAG? So that's big, hairy, audacious goals. It's a phrase that was thrown around a lot. Mike and I are similar ages as we were kind of going through our careers. And I love how you laid that out, because the BHAGs, the big, hairy, audacious goals, are incredibly valuable for getting you started or in that short term. But the way you did it on, I'm going to do this quarterly, like, that feels so doable. And maybe you'll get into that a little bit as we get into your book, The Fun Habit. Is that one of the keys, is not over prescribing so you have room for fun?
I think that's right. So I know we're jumping lanes to, the fun topics that we wanted to get into. But I think when I started studying fun, that is certainly one of it. Hustle porn, as I describe it, and I appropriated that from others, but, it's been so pervasive. And what was really interesting is we knew it was a problem, right? Because we're seeing burnout as an epidemic in all sorts of different professions. Certainly entrepreneurship and medicine, which is what I studied as a doctoral student. But I think more broadly across, the whole paradigm of different careers. And when the pandemic hit, and we had to put sort of bumper rails on the things that we were doing because, we had new constructs of what was important and new demands, especially as you mentioned, for folks that can't see me, I just turned 50, but I had two small kids. So like all the demands that became new during the pandemic, no matter where you were in life, though, I'm just describing where I was, but I think across the board, we reevaluated how we were spending our time, right? And certainly for the first time, knowledge workers and heuristic workers had to define their work more concretely because there was a pervasive problem that, and it still exists, but that knowledge work, we don't really know because it is a little bit ill-defined, like what is the goalpost, right? And so our to-do lists are, we're never going to be able to accomplish everything. So at some point we do have to make compromises, or we have to get creative what the goalpost looks like. And where I'm going with all that is that all of us kind of got awakened to the fact that our lives aren't meant to be all work. And luckily, in parallel, empirical evidence, in both clinical psychology and social psychology has proven that when we are overprescribed with work, we tend to be less productive. So there's this paradox, right? Like you often hear it, defined as busy versus work, right? So you're busy for 65 hours of the week, but is that true work, based on non-vanity metrics, or sometimes referred to as KPIs, right? Like if you're looking at being a hard worker as sort of 65 hours in front of the computer, it is, but somebody else is looking at it from productivity. So in 35 hours, they can get 3 times as done because they have built the resilience and they have a life that's more satisfying to them, so that they have more vitality and vigor during the time that they're actually working. Which life is better? And I would tend to think that the one where you're deriving a lot of pleasure and you're also more productive in a shorter amount of time, my argument is said is a life better lived. So
let's run down a rabbit trail here.
Sure,
you're kind of hitting me right between the eyes, right out of the gate. Thank you very much for knowing me better than you should this fast. But so the non-vanity metric. I'm a little bit older, 56. You said you're 50. I've spent my life probably overly focused on the vanity metrics of, well, I work 60 hours a week. Like I always used to joke, 40 hours a week? What is that, a part-time job? Like what dude, seriously, that's all you do? And it's so easy to get sucked into that, because then you pat yourself on the back going, yeah, well, I put in my hours. How do you, any tips on how to shift from that? Because I don't want to. I don't care anymore. We run our own business. No one cares if I work 40, 90, or 20 hours a week, as long as the company is providing what we promise our clients we're providing. So any guidance for that person that maybe is in a similar boat of saying, yeah, me too. I've been working these long hours. I like that as part of my identity, and I don't want to continue, but shifting that, it's almost guilt for, well, I'm not working as much as I should.
Yeah, no, I think one of the most important things is to re-examine why you feel that sense of duty, right? And what I've found is that the list is fairly unique to the individual, and it's broad. So I can certainly give forth some examples, but oftentimes like that might not resonate with a certain listener. So I want to invite whoever this might resonate with, like, figure out what it is that's leading you to believe that. But some of them can be the Puritan work ethic. It can be the way we were raised, right? So a lot of us were raised in households where that was the norm, right? I mean, my parents are certainly workaholics, so that was something that I had to unpack. Another is just, it's the company culture, right? So it's the social norms of your environment. And then sometimes busy feels good, right? So oftentimes, what is right. We all have bad habits that sort of help us relieve ourselves from discomfort. And so there can be discomfort in not being busy because we've been busy for so long, kind of the red line syndrome, as it were. And so you need to practice, that grace that you have with yourself, and realize that, do some self-experimentation, that if you give yourself a little bit time to rest, can you accomplish everything that you wanted to do within a certain amount of time, which then frees yourself up to have more fun. And so just to continue that on so that people realize why that's important, is that we now know through a host of different studies that when we do feel more fulfilled with leisure, so we're not using leisure for coping or escapism, but really to sort of fill our cup, that it opens up the ability to do harder work. So we become more creative, we're more productive for sure. And then we're also more resilient, so we get sick less. So it has all of this, all of these benefits, and yet we're devoiding ourselves of that. And oftentimes I use the parallel to where we were with sleep in the 80s. So again, yes, we're older, so we remember that. I think a lot of folks like Gen Zs don't, because they, sleep is so as fundamental to our well-being. You rarely see someone, champion sleep deficits, right? But you remember when we were 100%. Grinding it out, like, oh man, you don't need to sleep, bro.
That's right.
Like, and now that's just met, with an asinine response, which is the appropriate response, because you'll get really sick. And now I think sort of the secondary enlightenment is going to be leisure, and you're seeing that across the board, right? Like folks that from my ilk that really get the nitty gritty of performance analytics and the disciplines of IO and things of that nature. especially in Fortune 500, they're actually incentivizing employees to use their PTO because like it's so ingrained in our culture. Companies can't even get their folks to take 2 weeks off. So if companies understand that it's a productivity problem, then we certainly need to get in line. Like if they realize that there's a monetary benefit to them to incentivize you to
go away for a bit. Exactly. Exactly.
Then I mean, why, especially for folks that are self-employed, I mean, you can now follow the money. It's not just, good for your well-being. We all, it's proven by numbers as well. So
yeah, that was a valuable rabbit trail. Well done. All right. So you set this 25-year project, and then 10 years into the project, you made this major discovery that your pursuit of happiness was actually making you unhappy. Can you explain what happened, how that came about? I know it was a tough part of the journey. Unpack that for us a little bit.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to start from the beginning, because generally when I'm asked this question, I jump right into, sort of this misfortune that I had. So since you gave me the ability to talk about 2007, I mean, that was a really great time. I met one of my main mentors, a gentleman by the name of Michael Gervais. I got to him early. I think he was still getting his clinical hours. Now, he has a popular podcast about mastery and things of that nature. But, and at the same time, there was this big groundswell in positive psychology. And so through Michael, I got really interested in psychology, and was also invited to be part of the charter for the International Positive Psych Association. So this was all 2007. And I drank that up. I went to all the congresses. I studied Seligman, I studied Csikszentmihalyi, I studied Diener, and all this stuff was working. I was doing all of what you're supposed to. I became a practitioner of mindfulness. I, kept a gratitude journal. I was using all the tools, and I was also really getting into the quantified self movement. A little bit later, my wife and I moved to San Francisco, so I got to meet Gary Wolf, and even though they're quantified self meetups all over, the primary one was in San Francisco, so I got to meet the real folks. We did some of our meetups in Singular University, like all these folks that are really hardcore. And so I had everything, not just qualitatively from the positive psych side, but on the quantitative side too, like tracking, and looking for correlations of what could make me happier. And then in 2016, my younger brother unexpectedly passed away from a pulmonary embolism. And so that kind of knocked me on my butt. And also, I've always kind of run anxious. I think a lot of us A-types do. And so my medicine for that was endurance activity. And so I, never did it competitively, but I, was in it enough that I had done a couple Ironman, a couple half Ironman. And during that period, right after after my brother passed, I found out that advanced osteoarthritis. It really hadn't been painful up to that point. And then all of a sudden, my femoral head was just locking up. And so, got the MRI, and they're like, your femoral head, the bone is sitting right on your pelvis. Like, you're not going to be able to run again. And so like now, now I couldn't be active. Then also we found out that, this wasn't necessarily a direct negative event, but my wife got an amazing opportunity out in North Carolina. And so that moved us away from our support structure from family and friends. And I'm here now. I love, the state, but it wasn't, when I really needed that connection with family and friends, we had to leave that. And I just the more I chased, these tools that had been effective and wanting them to work and chasing happiness, as it were, I found myself less happy. And I was wondering why. And so I just finished my doctoral work, and, being the PhD, I know you are as well. Went to PubMed. I had to
of course
diagnose myself. Right. And I guess serendipitously, there was emerging in science at the time that showed how the Western approach to happiness is so flawed, that not necessarily valuing happiness, which I still do, is a bad thing, but being overly concerned about, especially your own happiness, really has been shown to be detrimental, right? And now we know, I think it's more common why that is, but the main mechanism for that is there's two things, right? You tend to perseverate on that gap from where you are and where you want to be, right? So especially if there's some sort of setback or, an unfortunate life event, like a big change, or unexpected death or a divorce, things that you don't necessarily have control over, nor are they going to fix themselves, in the immediate future. You're still left thinking like, well, I want to be here, right? And the second thing is that you can't really, you get stuck in your own head. So you start to burn that energy, by perseverating on thought rather than taking action. And so what I found was that even though, happiness is this emotional state, in psychology, we call it subjective well-being, that requires some introspection, some expenditure of emotional energy. We can almost always find delight and joy in the moment. Like literally, if we decide to do it, we don't necessarily have to be happy, because happiness or being happy wasn't an appropriate response to that period of life, right? Like I didn't want to go out and feel happy. Sure. I hadn't mourned or really digested my brother's death, but that didn't stop me from going out and enjoying life, and not feeling guilty about it. It kind of closes the loop of what you were saying. Again, a lot of these times we hold these burdens, right? Like I need to be working, or I can't feel happy right now, or I can't feel joy or delight because of this happenstance. But when you start to flex this agency and autonomy you have and relinquish any, manufactured guilt, you can still have a pretty good life even when things aren't going your way. And so this concept of fun as an action-oriented approach to dealing with life when things aren't going your way, I found is a really effective tool. And as I got into it, as any good researcher, I found this huge research gap. And that's what's been really fun, since that time, because it really saved me, right? Because I started realizing like, hey, I could have fun. I could connect with friends and go out and have these good times, or engage in activities that I really, hadn't done in a long time, and reconnect with even things that weren't previously there. And as I was indexing these fun experiences, it slowly started to pull me out of this pit of despair, but then still gave me the space to be able to digest, some of the bad things that had happened, and also reframe, the fact that I did need to get a hip replacement. And so over time, being able to celebrate the gains and the fact that I could index these fun activities started to support my mental health rather than, pull my mental health down by using, my hours to sort of wallow in the mire, as it were.
Wow, there's so much there. The first thing that pops out is I love how you talked about this. Well, I shouldn't be happy now because doggone it, my brother who I love just passed away unexpectedly, or I shouldn't be happy now because the world situation is this way, or I shouldn't be happy now because my best friend is really struggling with a divorce they're going through, or whatever. So you distinguish that, and then I'm still internally feeling like there's a little bridge between doing the same with the fun piece. The fun sounds like it's more in that moment. I'm going to enjoy this moment. Is that the difference? Like it still feels like,
right.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the tools that I often talk about is something that I came up with called the play model.
I was going to ask about that. I love that.
Yeah. So, because 4-quadrant models are just really useful, right? And so, especially in a podcast like this, it's always neat when you give it to somebody that's not used to them and they're like, wow, this is, but they're really effective tools for a whole host of, so anyone that, is trying to solve a problem, I suggest it. So for me, the problem was I wanted to really enjoy my time better. Right. And so it was taking a time out of how I was spending my week. And what I realized was a lot of time was spent on introspection that was making me more miserable, because I was trying to unpack these things and spending way too much time on trying to understand why I wasn't happy, when I didn't need to answer that question, right? Because there was a good reason that I wasn't happy, nor did I need to be. And so as soon as I saw that I was wasting a lot of time on this, I was able to switch that time into things that I enjoyed by looking at the options that were in front of my face and trading out, this time of things that weren't that fun for things that were fun. So the play model is just looking at how you spend your 168 hours in any given week, and then sorting each hour by either play stands for pleasing, living, agonizing, and yielding. And agonizing are the things that really do suck, but that we can't really get around, so, things that we expend a lot of energy and really aren't that fun at all. Yielding are the ones where we're not spending much energy and aren't fun. And that tends to be the low hanging fruit, because oftentimes that is things like, overthinking, doom scrolling, mindless television watching, or habitual habits where when we actually, look at them mindfully, we're like, wow, why am I still doing that? Friendships of convenience, or, meetings that you go to each week that you do just because you feel some sense of duty. But when you peel it back even just one layer, like, I don't need to go to that meeting. I could do something. So it applies to both life and work, right? And then pleasing activities are ones that are easy to do, things like playing with your children, playing with animals, engaging in activities that you like. They can be low arousal activities like reading a book or going to, any kind of self-care. And then living are really those peak experiences, right, that expend a lot of energy. So it's not something that we can over-index because we get exhausted, but that lead to insights. We know through the science of awe and wonder that when we connect to things bigger than ourselves, right, that are either through exerting effort or because they're just majestic, they really facilitate growth, right? And so if you look at the way you're spending your time and you don't see too many activities in the living quadrant, you want to ask yourself why, right? And that doesn't mean jumping out of a plane, right? It could be spiritual growth or whatever it is for, that's meaningful to you, or mastering a new skill, right? Like if you're a we'll say pianist, since I can't say violinist, but whatever you're up to. So that I use that tool and realize, man, I'm wasting a lot of hours on things that aren't very productive. And, it's just so illuminating. And all of a sudden, then you can go, well, do I want to live this life? And I didn't. And so then I started sprinkling in, activities that brought me more joy. And again, what we know from the science is that once you're able to do that, indexing that, one, takes your mind off of what was bothering you. And then you can factor in moments where you can process if you want, because those become more productive because they have a purpose, right? Rather than perseveration. But another thing, and one of the things that I think is the most interesting, is that we undervalue the time spent in pleasing activities, right? So even just gardening or playing with your pets or taking a nature walk, what we now know is that if you are devoid of those types of activities so that you feel like you're living a pleasureless life, you get burnt out and you don't do the hard stuff. So I often cite this amazing study out of MIT, Stanford, and Harvard that followed around 28,000 individuals. And oftentimes in psychology research, you give the participants a pager and kind of check in on their daily activities. So they would check in on the individual, what they were doing in that moment, and and how much pleasure they were deriving from that particular activity. And what they thought they were going to find, and actually they did, was that folks that are in sort of moments of crisis tend to look for activities that alleviate that discomfort, right? So when we're feeling crappy, we tend to, seek out forms of escapism. And sometimes those can be positive, and oftentimes they're not so positive, right? But what was remarkable about the study is that when people have a good mix, so a healthy mix of leisure in their life, and we now know through work out of UCLA coming from Dr. Cassie Holmes, that it's probably about 2 hours a day, so 14 hours a week, which when you think about it in the context of 168 hours, is really nothing. If you're in about that Goldilocks spot, that you enable yourself to do the harder work, the harder fun, within your week. And I think that's just a really important insight. Again, going back to the parallel of sleep, that we're going to find that we're so devoid, especially, the sandwich generation, of, just pulling 14 hours a week off the table for ourselves, that by just that minimal amount of self-care, by doing that, we can give so much more of ourselves. And then the neat thing is you can start, once you really want to get to the, like all of us who want to over optimize, right? You can start to play with what those 14 hours mean. So, a form of fun, as long as it's in line with your identity and values, can be volunteering, right? So like for me, I'm looking for opportunities to contribute to Habitat for Humanity because I want to learn how to build. And I just think that's fun, rather than like working in the soup kitchen or whatever, right? Although that might be fun for somebody else, sure. Right? So, you can start to play with what leisure, quote unquote, leisure even means. It doesn't have to be, if you feel like it's too self-centered, you can even start to play with that construct. Although I would argue that some of it should feel like it's, for us too, because you give too much away, then right. Exactly.
I didn't even need to prepare questions for this. Man, this is so awesome. You're just giving me every single time you respond. I'm like, okay, there's 5 other questions I got to ask him now. So let me just lay out the grid so people can have it in their heads. And again, we'll have links to his book and his website so you can pull this up. But it's yielding and agonizing at the bottom. And at the top, it's pleasing and living.
Correct.
Got that? Okay. Yeah. And then question about the peak experiences. Actually, several questions I jotted down here. I love the Goldilocks spot. I'm sure you didn't start that, but good integration, man. That's a great one. So peak experiences. I literally just wrote an article about, and I didn't call it peak experiences, but it was tuning into what makes your heart sing or your eyes light up or whatever it might be. Is part of the living piece tuning into those things you're already doing? So for example, I just love music. So it doesn't matter if I'm working out in the garage and I've got some music I love, or driving down the road in the Jeep or whatever. I realized as I was writing this, I really love that. Is part of it tuning into versus pursuing? Or play that out with me a little bit here. What do you think?
I think that's right. So, because a lot of these constructs kind of start to fit in a Venn diagram, right? So there are definitely, it shares DNA with Csikszentmihalyi's flow, but
I actually wrote that down. It reminds me of Csikszentmihalyi's flow diagram. Yeah, exactly.
But I tend, with regards to the way, I use it, is more in line with Maslow's self-actualization, that it's things that stretch our understanding of how we see the world. Because when you're truly engaged with something, through pleasure, then it's a connection to that other thing. And it pulls us out of this sort of me construct into a we construct. So that could be, an amazing night with your partner, or an amazing connection to nature, or, for someone that's mastering a new skill, it could be a connection to that skill. But it's really that there is something that the world is giving me that I'm deriving pleasure with. So you don't feel so caught up in yourself, because there is this world of abundance, of both pleasure and pain, right? And so we're never going to be devoid of pain, right? We know that, toxic positivity is definitely a real thing that can be empirically validated. And again, part and parcel to what we talked about, that happened to me, right? I was certainly succumbing to my own toxic positivity. But when we reach those peak experiences through a bias towards fun, so that we're kind of edging our bet, that we're prescribing ourselves more positive than negative, then we get to benefit from the abundance of pleasure that life can give us, because there's also an abundance of pain, right? I mean, loss, unfortunately, is part of the human condition, right? We have parents at some point, if you know where I'm going with that, right? And so those things are going to happen, but we have a lot of autonomy and agency. We don't have control over the things that are going to happen to us, but we can stack the deck, right? And so by making sure that while we're doing that, as where we're designing a life that hopefully is more pleasurable than painful, then having things that are deliberately in that living quadrant allows us access to knowing that there is actually something more greater than our personal pleasure. That, like, because if we connect to nature, we likely want to protect it, right? If we connect to a new skill, we're going to be drawn to being the best we can be at that thing. If we're connected to a partner or a friend, then we, through compassion, want to develop that and have that thing grow, right? And we know through mirror neurons and all sorts of stuff that, and the release of oxytocin, that helps contribute to our well-being as well, right? And so that is a deep well of growth, where we know from pleasing that, it's more pedestrian and we can do the harder stuff. I wouldn't say that has its limits, but it's certainly just at, one level of the what I call the fun pyramid, because it's easy to call it that.
Yeah. Maslow, I don't know if you knew, we interviewed Scott Barry Kaufman about his rewrite of Maslow's stuff. That was super interesting. Again, you just gave me 5 more questions. I love what you talked about with the volunteering. Not just doing it because, I should be volunteering, but you found Habitat for Humanity, great organization, obviously, but something that you were like, this is part of my living. Like, I want to learn this, and I get to contribute with the process while I'm learning. Help us explore that more, because I hear so often that people are like, well, I just do this because I should be doing this. You got to contribute to society. Right, but there's so many different ways we can contribute to society. Why do it in a way that makes you grumpy? Why not do it in a way that brings out the best Mike that there is? I love that concept. Can you give us just a little bit more on how to find those things or integrate that into your life in some way?
Yeah, well, first, let's start with the fact of how important that is, right? So for the final chapter of the book, I kind of dig into how fun is a great vehicle for social change. And part of what I discovered in researching that chapter was the fact that so many folks that do have, either empathic inherent traits or, just feel this sense of duty to contribute, are just as vulnerable to burnout as, say, an A-type entrepreneur or a physician. And sometimes even more so, because for the sake of feeling like, it's their sense of duty to contribute and not taking anything off, they're some of the most vulnerable for not, for lack of self-care or for, going down with the ship, right, when they didn't need to. And so figuring out how you can derive pleasure from contribution is important for the same reasons that we've talked about throughout this podcast. It's going to allow you to contribute more. And so I would posit to anyone that's sort of not deriving pleasure from their contribution to ask themselves, are they being their, yeah, exactly. Because likely if they take a critical look at that approach, they'll realize that they're actually not being a good steward of that contribution, because they could either give themselves more, or what's unfortunate is a lot of times, especially if they're engaging in group dynamics, though that ill will, like, what are we doing here, is contagious. And so they can take, so there's a whole host of, negative waves that come from when you're not deriving pleasure from the way that you're contributing. So it's really, you've touched on a hot button topic that I think, if you find yourself in that position, again, because there's so many ways to give back, ask yourself why you're not, taking a little bit of pleasure in what you're doing.
Mike, that is huge. I think, well, anyway, that's awesome. All right. Another rabbit trail you sent me down in the pleasing piece. Is there something about the perspective we have about the activity? So the reason I asked that is I just noticed this weekend, we live on some land out in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I needed to mow. We have some family coming out, and I wanted to get some rocks dug out. And I've noticed I love both those activities. Like if I can spend 2 hours out mowing our lawn on a beautiful day, I'm happy with that. Digging rock, I love that. Except when I feel like I have to, like I need to get it done. It's got to be done by tomorrow. So is there something in these aspects that differentiates between, say, pleasing and yielding? As I look at your chart here, would that be the difference? Is perspective or time move something that would be pleasing in the right situation, same exact activity, digging those rocks out or mowing or whatever, down into yielding? Or is there something there?
I think that's right. No, you're absolutely right. So I would, in the book, I get into a host of different tools. This work comes from Timothy Wilson out of University of Virginia. How could you story edit it so that you're either compartmentalizing, the fact that there is this sort of angst, due to a time constraint, like, can you schedule it differently? Can you think about it differently? And actually this one's from Dr. Woolley out of Cornell. Is there a way to refocus what you do enjoy so that you can compartmentalize, especially since this is episodic, right? Because again, it would be toxic positivity to say, is there something truly, that causes you despair to completely compartmentalize it? But this isn't, right? This is a mindset. And so, try to use the skill set of mindfulness to focus on the things that really, what do you enjoy about that activity? And you likely will bring it back into the pleasing, like, oh yeah, I remember that I like this. That's just, kind of nonsense. And then another tool that I often talk about is something called activity bundling. So, and you've already mentioned you're a music fan, like in mowing, if you have a lot of negative self-talk, can you throw on your headphones and listen to, whatever lights you up and make the activity that much more pleasurable? Because one, now you're, silencing the monkey mind, as it were. And two, you're listening to some awesome music.
Right. All right. Excellent. And then before we go on, you mentioned the phrase toxic positivity. I know what you're talking about there, but I'm guessing a lot of our listeners accidentally fall into that. We got a lot of health and wellness coaches, a lot of people that are dialed in on their own health and wellness. They see life with the glass half full. They're optimistic, positive people, but that can easily, in the wrong situation, flip that tipping point. So can you talk us through just a few of the basics around toxic positivity, how to recognize it in myself, and maybe some tweaks to make that truly positive and not toxic?
Yeah, I think for the most part, it's just an overprescription on thinking that you have to be happy, right? And so one of the professors I like the most in this area is Dr. Iris Mouse out of Cal Berkeley, who's looked at this quite a bit, or at least aspects of it. And I mean, in short, it really is thinking that you always have to have a Pollyanna, optimist viewpoint on things where that might not necessarily be appropriate. And so the downsides are plenty, right? Again, we've talked about some. You're going to create distance between, this ideal that's probably not realistic and where you are. And so you're going to see this gap as problematic. Two, when it's overprescribed and it keeps not happening. So you're like, well, I'm told that I'm supposed to be happy or have an optimistic view, and this research comes from Sonia Luber-Mirsky, gratitude is certainly, we believe, been overprescribed, right? So like for folks to have this prescription that they have to be grateful for 3 things every day, and if they don't, somehow there's this failure. Well, that will start to bleed into your identity, right? Because those things that are in misalignment of perhaps just the happenstance of that day, you start to believe like, well, then I just must not be a happy person or a grateful person or an unlucky person, which is really unfortunate, right? Because that's not even a real thing. And so allowing that in and starting to believe the misconceptions that you always need to be happy or positive or optimistic can cause some real harm. It's toxic. And so that's the short of it. Right. And the best way to avoid it, to have a prophylactic, is realize that it's a thing and realize you don't need to be happy every day. And I think one of the best things, there's a couple of things. One for the geeks in the audience like me is self-experimentation, right? Like realizing that, especially if you're going down the PubMed rabbit hole, realize that most of these studies still follow a Six Sigma normal curve. So maybe the intervention was amazing and like it, has an 80% success rate. You still might be part of the 20%. Right. None of these things were meant to be for everyone yet. Unfortunately, because of social media, they're prescribed as such, right? So just know that if something doesn't work, you can throw it out. I think this is kind of a random sort of anecdote, but like mainly because I am A-type myself. Like one of the best pieces of wisdom came from Tim Ferriss when he said, if you don't like a book, just put it down. Yep. And like before I got that, I would read, speaking of the play model and like, indexing.
Oh my gosh.
And like the same advice applies to life, right? Like if something isn't great, just put it aside. You don't need to second guess why it didn't work for you, right? And so that's one. And then the other is just knowing that it's a fallacy, and allowing yourself some grace, that things don't always have to be happy, and giving yourself some time to process. So like one of the last pieces of advice, again, this comes from psychology, is if you really do feel like there's something that you need to process, give yourself a finite amount of time to do that. And so that was another tool, it's getting deeper in the weeds, but that I did with my brother is like, okay, in this 168 hours, I'll give myself 1 hour where I'm just sad, and I sit with it. Maybe I toy with some ideas, instead of looking at it from a psychological standpoint, deal with some of the philosophical aspects of it. And then I'm done and I move on to the next thing, right? So that it doesn't encompass, and move on or bleed into things that should be more enjoyable.
Yeah. The book advice is fantastic. And I didn't hear Tim say it. We interviewed Morgan Housel, and he mentioned that same idea of you give it a couple chapters, and if you spend $11 on the book, like don't spend $500 of your time or more than that working your way through it. And what I've done with that is I have 3 books going at once that are of different genres, different styles. And so I don't necessarily put it away for good. I put it away for the moment, pick up a different one, and maybe my mood or my focus has changed 2-3 days later when I come back to that seat. So anyway, that's great advice, folks. If you didn't hear that, basically don't force yourself to read a terrible book, or terrible for you. It may be a good book. It's just not for you at this point. Okay, I'm watching the clock. We're going to stay with that hour, my friend. But what about the person who says, I get it. They're a manager, they're a teacher, they're a parent. They believe in the keeping the work and the play separate. Or the person listening and says, yeah, I get the concept, but I'm in survival mode. I'll do this when I fill in the blank, when I graduate, when I retire, when the kids go off to live their lives, whatever. What do you say to that person that's putting off the fun piece until after X happens?
Yeah. So I think, we've really covered it throughout the hour, but again, I would take a step back and question why you believe that, right? Is it inherent social norms? Is it some sort of conditioning, based on your current environment? Is it true? Like, for instance, if you've signed up for the episodic, dutiful sort of commitment of med school, that might be appropriate for a short amount of time. But if it's habitual, again, if it's because you're in the sandwich generation and it's only because you feel like, it's your sense of duty to live that way, you've now been informed with all the reasons that logic is folly, that you're actually doing yourself a detriment. You're not being your best self for the folks that need you, and you're likely not doing you're not being as productive as you could be, and you're certainly not living a joyful life. And so being critical, maybe doing one or two small experiments. Like another great experiment that comes from, again, Cassie Holmes out of UCLA, is just going into your weekend, treating it like it's a vacation. And there's, with regards to that intervention, there's nothing else that you need to do. Just be like, this is my time. And maybe even, your kids are involved or whatever, but like, this is meant to be a break. And you don't need to change up your schedule. But what she's found is just that small little reframe allows folks to have, make those small, low-level decisions that will make activities more pleasurable. Like, yeah, I'm still going to clean my house, but I'm going to do it, with music that I enjoy on the back, or this time spent with my kids, instead of feeling like a sense of duty, I need to take them to the park, I'm going to go do something fun with them, that we can enjoy together, like going to a baseball game or whatever. It just allows you to make better choices. And so even if you feel that way, my advice to that group would be like, well, what are the subtle shifts that you can do to just like understand the value of pleasure a little bit more? Because if you really can't find, begin with like 1 or 2 hours that you're enjoying yourself, like there might be deeper seated problems. And to be quite honest, a fun expert isn't going to help you. You might need to start with someone else.
Go with a different book. Get his book as one of your 3 you got reading right now, but then put another one with it. Oh, that is funny. Good job. All right, your 50th newsletter. I love the classic nature of this story that I read about you is hilarious. So, okay, guys, he's doing this newsletter. His 50th newsletter comes out celebrating the halfway mark of this 25-year project. Comes out precisely the exact month that this little thing called a worldwide pandemic happened. What, like, seriously, what went through your head? What lessons did you learn about happiness and fun through that period?
No, that's wild. No one's called me out on that. This one, this one is, I haven't addressed it yet. You put me on the spot, but here
we go, folks.
We put out a press release that said, this is going to be the year of fun. And then, the book was ready to roll, and the pandemic hit. And I unpacked this in the book, but I had a tough time. I ended up getting COVID and had, for 5 to 7 months, had really bad long hauler symptoms. And so it was great in the sense that, after all that was over, because it was pretty dark for a little bit, it gave me insomnia, which I guess, And so speaking of sleep, I intimately learned what a lack of sleep can do. Fortunately, all that's resolved itself, but I used the tools, that are showcased in the book to pull myself back out. I think whenever, I would never want to go back to 2016 and, this was a challenge, not the same, but it was a challenge nonetheless, and certainly wasn't finding very much pleasure, and just started reintegrating the tools. And okay, so how can I, in this compromised state, start to find more pleasure, compromised in both mental wellness, because again, the insomnia, and then the fact that our whole schedule had been, ransacked, right? Because our kids were now home, and it worked in an amazing fashion. So it was quite wild, and quite validating to be, it was fun. There's an author's note in the book, okay, this has now been battle tested. It was kind of neat, and more of a tale of self-discovery. And now it's a true textbook.
Seriously. I mean, that and the authenticity that brings is so powerful. It almost shifted you from the potential for toxic positivity, or at least some, to this is real stuff, folks. Like, look, I'm in the midst of this. I'm not sleeping well. I've got this. By the way, we interviewed Matt Fitzgerald. You probably know Matt. He's super endurance athlete, wrote the 80-20 training plan. He went through long COVID, and he shares all the details in the midst of it. Man, I do not. That's tough stuff. So I'm sorry that you had to go through that, but the value I think that brings to your book in terms of authenticity and reality is huge. Was there one example of something? I know you obviously did several things, but in the midst of that, because I can't imagine the sleep piece. That would just drive me off the wall.
Again, something I haven't shared, but you touched on it. So, and to your point, I do want to be as authentic as possible. The one gift. So when you have clinical insomnia, eventually you get clinical depression, which I've never had before. Like I said, I've had anxiety issues, but I've never, I didn't know what that felt like. And so for several weeks, you're immersed in that. And so I would never, I put it in the book, in that state, that's something you can't understand unless you've gone through it. So I think I might've made bold claims, because it's really, it's interesting when you've not gone through that valley. And so, again, I wouldn't say that anything that we've talked about today would be a prescription for clinical depression, because that is a thing where you need some help. So anyways, I just,
that's important. Thank you for saying that.
So but you invited it because I think that was the gift. Without that wisdom, I think, I would have gone on here and if you're going through malaise or, some sort of melancholy, like we can get you, right back on your feet. Like, now there are going to be some times if, there's something going on with your biology, you need some help, so.
Right. That's awesome. Mike, this was fantastic. Like I said, I didn't get to have my questions. You were so fun with all the potential rabbit trails you set up and everything else. So thanks for doing this. Congrats on your book. We will have links to all his information, websites, book, etc. You guys, you got to go get this thing. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Dr. Mike Rucker, everyone. Again, his book is titled The Fun Habit, and it's available anywhere you buy books. He's a great one, by the way, to follow on Twitter, as he has over 100,000 followers. You'll find him at Perform Better. Thanks for tuning into the #1 podcast for health and wellness coaching. If you'd like to tap into our weekly Catalyst 5, what that is it's 5 very brief but evidence-based tips and tricks to make the most of our personal and our professional lives. We've got the link available in the description below if you want to tap into that. And if you have any questions about a career in health and wellness coaching or bringing nationally board certified coaching into your organization, please reach out to us anytime. results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Now it's time to be a catalyst. This is Dr. Brad Cooper of the Catalyst Coaching Institute. I'll speak with you soon on another episode of the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.